Okay, you guys ready? I want to thank everybody for coming in this morning, 8 o'clock. We'll get started. A joint meeting between the finance committees of the school and the city. I'd like to start off by having each of you introduce yourselves, just to make sure that you know each other, and then we'll get started from there, okay? We want to start here at the end.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rebecca Ogle, serve on the school board for District 4.
Dwayne Lutz, school board.
Joe Edwards, City Council, Westfield.
Troy Patton, city council. Scott Fry, city council, District 4.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. All right, we'll get started here. Meeting, going to focus on teamwork because we're all in this together, right? I mean, this is the two largest taxing bodies in Washington Township, and everything that we do affects you, and everything you do affects us. We're joined at the hip, and so this is about teamwork, and we're going to lead off with Brian this morning, and I'll turn it over to him. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, John. So as John said, it's about teamwork. John and I stay in pretty constant communication, and I think I've talked to Scott and Troy before, and we have our monthly meetings, and John and I are just kind of talking. We never really get together. I know we all know each other in one form or another, but really to have both groups together to have conversations, since we do affect each other so much in our decision-making process. So we thought it'd be good for us to just get together and kind of talk about our budgets and have that discussion, and then depending on where conversation goes today, we have other spreadsheets made up where we can continue to have these meetings and kind of go over different topics different times. So today we figured it'd be a good start just to kind of go over our 21 budgets and kind of have that discussion. So for the school system, if you've watched the school board meetings, because they're very exciting, I know, in the school budget presentation, there's a lot more slides that go into all of these, but we kind of condensed it down so we could fit it into our little hour conversation time here. So 2021 school budget is advertised at $115 million. As we always tell our school board, we advertise high and come in low. Always make sure we're maximizing our budget every year. So we actually expect that to be closer to $110 million. A couple big kind of point outs for us this year. Rainy day fund. This is the first time the school's had a rainy day fund since 2012. By the end of this year, our rainy day fund cash balance will be $5.4 million. We're only allocating $1 million of it to utilize in case there are state funding cuts this next year. We are deeply concerned about that. It is half of our budget is state funding. So as we go through it, we want to make sure we're able to respond to that. That's also why we wanted to make sure we got that increase to $5.4 million this year, because that represents roughly 10% of our education fund budget.
Question.
Yes.
Does this represent state and local both, or is this just local?
Yeah, sorry. So to break it down, so the education fund for us is state funding. So that $55 million is all from the state sources. Your operating referendum and your capital referendum are clearly the two referendums that the school system have. Debt service and operations, those would be your tax-rated funds that come from tax dollars.
Thank you.
The rainy day fund is, I'm assuming similar to your guys's, it's where we're able to put dollars to have for a rainy day. So while we have money allocated in our rainy day this year, I'll tell you right now, our main goal is not to use it. That is our hope, is that we don't have to touch it. However, it is there. If we have to respond, we can respond with dollars on hand opposed to having to make cuts. When you look at our debt service fund for the school system, our debt rate is really the driver of our rate going down over the last couple of years. So everything in this graph on the right-hand side of the screen has all the future projects you've heard us talk about over the last several years. So if you've seen the Growing the Rockway presentation, where we talk about our early learning center, central office, expansions to athletic fields, transportation center, those type of items down the road, even performing arts, everything's built into this graph. So even as we look at doing those projects in the future, we still expect our tax rate to go down. The back end of this, of course, any graph generally has a lot of assumptions built in. So we are very conservative on our AV growth assumptions. I know we've had a couple great years. I think we all kind of know there's probably a recession coming at some point here. There will be a trickle down to everything with COVID going on. So all of those are built in. We do have a 7% growth rate, which quickly goes down to 3%, 2%, and 1% in the future years. So when you get towards kind of 2030, there's very minimal growth built in there at all. So this could go down faster. We could also adjust the timeline of a project if needed. But all of those projects are already built into this conversation as we continue. So I know this is a lot of information on this screen, but this is really kind of looking at tax rate over the last several years. 2019 is kind of the peak of our tax rate over the last several years, so $1.81. That is the year in which the capital referendum came on. So if you look at that third line down, you had 0 in 2018 and then 16.5 cents in 2019. A couple things I'd like to point out is all 90 million of those dollars have been issued. That rate will not go higher. Also, when we approved that rate, it was for 90 million or 30 cents. So we did do the full 90 million. We will never hit 30 cents. So 16.5 cents is 16, almost 17 cents is about where we will stay throughout the life of that loan. As we move into the future, it will continue to drop down, but we will never be at the 30 cents that was approved. The capital referendum or the operating referendum, sorry, is carried across at 20 cents. 2023 is the renewal year for that. So once we get through board elections, part of the conversation where we will starting with whatever our school board is at that time will be, what's the operating referendum look like? What's the rate need to be? What's that conversation need to be as we go forward? The operating referendum really does replace, we are one of the lower funded schools from the state level, and then also right now we lose about $6 million to circuit breaker loss every year. So that capital or the operating referendum really helps balance our budget through those dollars. But then kind of you just look over the prior history, 2019, 2020, 2021, we've gone from 2019 tax rate, total tax rate of $1.81, 2021 projected tax rates basically $1.4489. So pretty substantial drop over that time frame. And as we continue to look into the future, we expect to still see our rate continue to go down. We will not go down at the same rate clip we've gone down the last couple of years. A large piece of that is we've had some pretty big debt issuances fall off over the last several years, and we don't plan to issue enough to replace those debts, so we know it's going to continue to decrease. So circuit breaker impact. As we talked, that's one of the biggest impacts for us when we look at our need for the operating referendum, other than kind of the state funding side of things. So 2016 to 2020, we've lost anywhere, 2018 or 2019 last year, we lost about $9.4 million to circuit breakers, so roughly 17% of our budget. The one thing I'd point out is as our levy has gone up over the last several years and it kind of went down last year, our percentage loss has changed. So while we're losing more dollars, we're also collecting more dollars. So, I focus more on the percentage lost and then also just generally the total number we do factor in as well. The biggest piece for us, and I will tell you from a school's perspective, is our tax rate has to go down. That is the only way you get rid of circuit breaker at the end of the day. AV has to go up, tax rates have to go down. If both of those are working in the right direction, we know our circuit breaker is going to go down. So as we look into the future, we want our tax rate to go down. We've wanted it to go down the last several years. It's been a very big focus for us. And as it continues to go down, we will continue to see our circuit breaker decrease, which will overall help fully fund our budget.
I just have a quick question. I mean, it's just more out of curiosity. Why does everybody always talk about the circuit breaker? It's like it's going to go away at some point in time. I mean, it is what it is. Why do they always say, oh, well, we lost this much? No, they just, you only get taxed this much.
Yeah, well, so the reason why we always bring it up is I think some people just quite frankly don't understand that when I levy $54 million, I know I'm never going to see $54 million.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to note that I levy 54, I'm only going to collect 47. I can tell you on the back end when I budget, 54 is a made-up number in my mind. I focus on 47.
Yeah.
So when I budget, I understand that. But I do think it's important for the community to understand there is that gap. So when you see me advertise $54 million, I'm not really getting 54.
Are you required to advertise 54?
Yeah. So
That's stupid.
well, here's the thing. If I were to advertise 47, if I went out and told you my budget's 47 and I advertised 47, that's not going to eliminate circuit breaker either.
Yeah.
Circuit breaker would still be there, so now I'm only going to collect 44. So then I would collect even less when I know I need 47 to operate on.
But I think it's also important to note that DLGF recognizes that, accounts for it, so therefore we have to.
Yeah.
So you see a line in everybody's budget, circuit breaker. Oh, I think there's a ton of money sitting there. It's got to go somewhere because it's value out recognized in the community, and it has to be put on somebody's book.
Yeah.
So kind of other piece of your answer, like
the permanent reconciling item.
Well, it just adds an unnecessary level of complexity to probably an otherwise complex
Yeah.
calculation.
Right.
Yeah, agreed.
so the piece I would kind of disagree on long term is that circuit breaker never goes away. In the sense of it's written into the law and that will always be there, I agree with, but in the sense of once AV gets high enough and our total tax rate for all entities gets low enough, circuit breaker will go away. And that's kind of where our long-term projections of where we need to get to. Because the other piece is the way tax law is written right now in the state of Indiana is if you lose a certain amount of money, then your circuit breaker is divided out for us between operations and debt service. And I can just say I'm going to lose roughly, equivalent between the two. If your circuit breaker is basically right now 10% or below, my debt's going to be fully funded and I'm going to lose everything in operations. So in the sense of how's that impact me, it impacts me greatly in operations. So really, my long-term goal is I need to get as close to zero as I can, because at a certain point, as our rate continues to go down, you see I'm at 13%. I'm getting pretty close to 10. So when I get down towards 10%, I'm going to now have to reallocate how I lose those dollars. So whereas right now I can allocate $7.3 million and know I'm going to lose roughly 3.4 in debt, I'm going to lose probably about 3.6 or so in operations and balance that. As soon as I hit that mark, I'm going to switch to where now I may be losing less money, like $5.5 million, but I'm going to lose $5.5 million in operations. So actually my operations fund just took an extra $2 million loss this year. So that's kind of why we need to drive it down quickly as well, so that way that's only a year or two that I have to make that adjustment, opposed to long term. So kind of looking at total tax rate, we just went through a lot of it, but a couple of the big pieces towards the bottom. Over the last 2 years, so 2019 to 2020, the school system's tax rate dropped almost 12%. 2020 to 2021, we're going to drop another 9.4%. The big thing I like to point out, because I know a popular conversation I've seen online is, yeah, your rate's going down because your AV is skyrocketing, which is completely true. It is. However, at the same time, our levy over the last 3 years has decreased as well. So our levy's gone down 2019 to 2020 about 1.5%. 2020 to 2021, it'll go down about 2.7%. So during the last 3 years, we've grown almost 400 kids. We've added more square footage to our school system, and yet we've still managed to actually drop our levy and drop our rate. So when we want to talk about doing more with less, we're doing it every year right now. We're truly making more happen with less money from tax dollars. Now, back into that is, yes, our state funded dollars, because their dollars per kid have gone up some. So our total budget has not changed much, but our state funded dollars really do pretty much 100% go to the classroom. On our education fund, about 98% of our education fund is spent on salary and benefits for teachers. So when we look at where our dollars going, and people, we always want to look back to how do we make cuts in education fund. If you're 98% salary and benefits, there's only really one spot when we need to make an adjustment, And that's why also looking into the future, knowing that state funding cuts are probably coming this next year, we have to have that rainy day, because we can't respond by cutting in the classroom, but that would be the only option we would have when we're 98% salary and benefits. So having that rainy day fund.
What would be your options if we had a 2 or 3 year slide because of whatever? I don't know what it might be, but.
So truly like an AV decline. So really for us is, we had an AV decline, our rate would probably go up at that point, because most of our projections are built on an AV increase. We know our circuit breaker would go up a little bit at that time. It would also depend on how state funding changes. If you pulled state funding out of it, how would we respond? We have a couple projects built in now over the next couple of years we would just pull off, so our maintenance would be deferred a little bit as we go forward, and we could probably catch up on that. One of the biggest changes we can usually make, quite frankly, is not buying 1 or 2 school buses. At $150,000 a bus, you can make some decent cuts by putting 3 off for a year. So really that would be our majority change at that point. And at this time also, we generally kind of under budget each year to help build up that rainy day, so we would have some reserves that we could tap into at that time.
So you think you might have enough in a rainy day to survive that kind of thing?
I think we could make it through a little bit, yes. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
I think the only thing I would add real quick is the not buying buses. That was done how many years in a row? Previous.
About 5 years in a row where there wasn't a single bus purchase in the district, which we've been spending the last 4 years now catching up on.
Right. So we've been that route, and now we're trying to catch back up on those, and think we've got that back in play. So if we had to put it off, we think we've caught our fleet back up to being at least adequate and serviceable.
But with half of your budget subject to state funding, you're really more at risk than we are for changes that are going to happen in that area. Could happen, I don't know that they will.
Absolutely.
That's a big at risk.
Well, that's certainly the variable the school corporations have to deal with that cities and towns necessarily don't have to at all, quite frankly. I'll breeze through this. This is not the entire deck from last week. This will be primarily more for Rebecca and Dwayne, but this is our construct moving into 21. Overall, and I'm not going to read this verbatim. Any questions, you can stop me here. That's our outlook. Yeah, the AV projected to go up 9.2, 9.3, and with the state average of 4.2. That's a historical view of where we've been in the net assessed value versus held against the state. I'll make some comments on that because it's appropriate for this group. This is our exploded view of all our revenue sources. LRS is local road and street, CCI is cume cap improvement, CCD is cume cap development, MVH motor vehicle highway. Fire in our overall tax structure has its own separate levy line. It's not commingled into general. Inside a general fund live all the other city operations. So police, park, public works in part. And then we get approximately $1 million a year by way of food and beverage that's purchased here inside the city. The exploded view of the overlapping tax units in 20. I won't go through those, but clearly we're all living in the same pool, as you might say. We put this in here just to kind of give some perspective as to a home here in Westfield. What's the average monthly tax bill, if you will, for the city services that are provided. This is notwithstanding any referendums that have been approved. AV, once again, new construction helps the school and the city. So let me just offer some perspective. I think this is important that these two units of government are not only here today, but probably moving forward. And I'm going to land on Brian's slide, I think the debt slide. So because of the Quality School Corporation, people desire to live here. Because of quality services and infrastructure, people desire to live here. So there's, and I don't want to sound cavalier, but I'll be very candid. People probably aren't moving here because of township government. People aren't moving here because of a solid waste district, and people aren't moving here because it's a fantastic library system, which that's not to sound disrespectful in any way, shape, or form. It has to do with the school corporation, number one. It has to do with the level of public services that is offered by the city. So we are very much joined at the hip. And so when we coordinate debt falling off to continue to perpetuate that quality of life by way of education, by way of just the environment that people desire to live in, I think it's very important that this conversation continues well into the future as debt falls off of the school because they are the driver and they're the biggest chunk of that overall tax rate. How do we, as city, coordinate our debt so it doesn't overburden and drive into this circuit breaker issue that is this mysterious thing and why we even have it, right? So I think, and I won't speak, I know what our debt is, but I know there's large tranches of debt retiring off of the school's books, and how does that affect overall in the immediate future and in downrange? As an example, our debt, we have a public safety building falling off the roll, but it's going to exceed what in issuance what's currently there today. So do we drive the tax rate up, create more circuit breaker issues? So coordinating all that together and having a clear understanding of, and I don't know what your large tranche of debt falling off, the school building or what it is, how that impacts the tax rate, how it impacts these economic development areas, the TIF districts that we have built out. Because those tax rate, the overall tax rate comes down, notwithstanding referendum that still rides on top of it. So as those things fall off, what are the long-term effects and how do we preserve that and still meet our obligations and keep a quality of life? And I know quality of life ends up being a very subjective civic discourse. However, I think our AV, when you compare it to the state average, I don't know if I'm going forward or backward here, half the time. When you compare those two lines, that's an important thing that when I talk to peers in other cities and towns, they would die for half of that. Half of that growth, and just be able to pay their bills, so to speak. So there are no two government entities that have got to coordinate on public finance more than the school corporation and the city. So I think that's more than just editorial comments from me. That's just facts. I can support it with data if you give me about 2 weeks to go out and really scrub it up and get fresh data sets, but that's just the reality. So I'll digress, yield the microphone, just have a conversation, but working together as we issue debt retires, how does that impact the overall tax bill, the tax rate? We can talk about rates all day long. It's the overall tax bill that comes in the mail or hits the escrow account, so. Anything else you'd like to do?
I do have a spreadsheet about how we impact each other. We'll go through it.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the conversations John and I had that kind of started a lot of this was just, how do we impact each other through our decision-making? A lot of the conversation originally started, I believe you guys just did a GO last council, and there was conversation, would it happen, wouldn't it happen? How would that truly impact everybody moving forward? Since we are above the cap by a lot at this point in total tax rate sense, whether you did it or not wasn't going to change a homeowner's tax bill. It would just kind of reallocate the circuit breaker dollars because they would be less. For this chart, I'll kind of walk through it real quick. There are a lot of assumptions built into this just because of the nature of the game, so please don't think they're 100% accurate numbers. We did share them with the people you guys work with as well on Johnson. Sorry, John, I forget their name. Just kind of make sure we all agreed at the general premise of the spreadsheet to kind of calculate future changes and how would it impact people. And it's also just because of where the conversation was, it is built on how the city would react more than anything. I could easily make a couple adjustments on the back end at some point to adjust it to how's everybody fare if the school does something different as well. But so walking through the spreadsheet, basically what I did is the first two sections are just 2019, 100% given data, 2020, 100% given data, then to get into 2021, which then you get a little bit of fluctuation. So you have the levy for basically all entities that could affect someone's tax rate around here, the assessed valuation for each entity, and then the rate driven off of that entity. Then I went through and calculated basically the percent total of the non-exempt levy. So I went and pulled out the referendums because for the census circuit breaker conversation, the referendums are a moot point. So while they're listed, they're completely pulled out, which is also why they're grayed out in the sense, and I also lumped both bars together. That way it was just one line opposed to two lines taking up more space. So once you get through it, then a circuit breaker that was applied to each unit, and then the actual levy collection for each unit. So you can see percentage circuit breaker loss as well as you run down through those areas, or percentage of the total circuit breaker that each unit gets. So generally there's some rough correlations here. When you look at tax rate, the school system in 2019 made up about 49% of the tax rate. We also received about 48% of the circuit breaker loss. So proportionately, they're pretty correlated as you get through. When you get down to then the 2020, you'll see similarly, we were 45%, we made up 42%, still pretty close correlation. What I did then for 2021 projections is took the average of the correlations between the numbers to project out into 21 as we make changes. So as you get in 2021, AV growth at this point, it's certified by the DLGF. We know what that is. So that is a known fact. What really comes down to is how are the different entities going to be changing their levy? Where I had to make some assumptions, if you look across the county and the township and everybody, pretty much everybody seems to be playing a rate management game. Everybody's rate from year to year generally doesn't change. What's really changing is they're just having a higher levy each year. If you look at, I think, the township's had the same rate for the last decade. So as our AV's gone up, the township's collected more money, so their levy's gone up, but the rate hasn't changed. For the sense of the spreadsheet, pretty much everybody I locked in levy. Did the same thing for the city of Westfield. So city of Westfield, generally, you guys have run a rate management side of things for future years, so your rates pretty much stayed the same. Your levy's what's gone up or down each year. So generally around here, it's gone up. So then I went in and plugged in the schools. So our levy did go down about $280,000 when you look at total levy. Referendum did go up $1.2 million because, again, we rate manage that. So the rate's stuck, so our levy is going to go up as we go over the next several years. So once you come in, you can kind of see this base scenario here. I'll just scroll down here. Nothing were to change. This is how much the school system next year is going to lose, about $5.5 million to the circuit breaker. Again, estimate numbers. That way, in case next year I lose 6 or 5, I don't want to, just want to know their estimates. City will probably lose 3.7, and then it kind of gives out basically, these are just kind of based on the baseline scenario. So theoretically, we're basically at 0 here for this conversation. So then if you come back up here, and let's say, because the conversation John and I were having is, if you didn't do the $5 million GO, I believe your $5 million GOs are paid back over 5 years. For simplistic terms, let's just say your levy dropped by $1 million then next year. So instead of going up $2 million, you just go up $1 million. So as your levy goes down $1 million, what you're going to see is the school system is going to collect about $345,000 of that levy decrease. The city, while you went down $1 million, you're only actually going to lose about $620,000. When you look, county wins pretty well. County wins when you make a decision like that. County's going to get about $250,000. And then basically through math is roughly you negate to just about 0, $10,000 off. So kind of built this just to talk about if you make $1 million decision, I don't get $1 million. I do get 345. That's nice. But it's not a one-for-one across the board as we went through that. So just kind of built this so John and I could have that conversation of how do we impact each other, how does that change everybody. Just wanted to share it with you so you could see it. Happy to dive into this more later. There are a fair amount of assumptions in this spreadsheet just to make it work, which is why if it's all perfect, it doesn't add up just to 0.
Yeah. Can you go back to the top, Brian?
Yep, the very top one.
Yeah. Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
So, can we ask questions about something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying. I mean, those are good points. So let me ask you this. So if, you know, one of the things that I always talk about is the TIF districts, you know, frankly. So if you had $70 million coming out of a TIF district, what would be the benefit to the schools?
So if you were to do a 70 million pass-through,
Yeah.
so realistically what we'd have to come down and do, and I'll just be honest, I'd have to rebuild the spreadsheet, is our AV would go up. With AV going
You
up.
get your percent plus your assessed.
Correct.
Times your
Yeah.
assessed, right?
So if you say you added 70 million in AV, then I would have to increase this AV number right here by $70 million.
Right.
This one wouldn't change because it already has AV built into it, or the TIF built in.
Right.
So our basic would go up 70%, which means theoretically our percentage of tax rate total would go down.
Yeah.
Because our rate necessarily for that would, or our collections would go up. Which then at the end of the day, what you're going to do is you're just going to see our total circuit breaker number go down at the end of the day. So if you release dollars, our circuit breaker will decrease.
Yeah.
You can see that $70 million worth of AV also come over on the city operations side.
Yeah. Yeah, some of it would, right?
So,
Yeah.
none of it's gonna be dollar for dollar.
Right. No, I mean, I realize, I mean, like some of the other, I'm just, you know, I mean, you know, we talk about the schools and, I mean, I don't want to talk about theory, I just want to ask questions, but you know, when I look at this and clearly my math isn't as good as this, I mean, I've just kind of tried to do it in my head, which is probably wrong, but I mean, you know, I mean, I think of it and I say, okay, I realize you're not going to get part of it because we talk about the schools being the #1 priority, but, you know, if we renew a TIF district that's been renewed once or twice or whatever, how much do the schools get back? Because clearly, I mean, even the $1 million, I'm not, I mean, if it, you know, it's not a zero-sum game, right? But it's still real dollars. I mean, that's, am
Yeah,
I think, right?
I agree.
Okay.
Hey Troy, what I can do is, so I built a spreadsheet around the assumption of levy change, so I could build it around AV change and
Yeah.
still make it to where we could kind of calculate what that would look
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
if you want.
Yeah, I was just trying to do it in my head real quick, but
Yeah.
clearly that's more complex than what I can handle. If it's 1 + 1, I can probably do it.
Did you and John make these up together?
What?
Excuse me.
This is all Brian's the genius.
Okay.
I just get to push buttons.
Can we get copies of that?
Yeah, John has a copy of the spreadsheet, so he
Okay,
can
all right.
send it over to you guys.
Well, it looks like we need to coordinate, it's like my place at the table. And
I would
and we've got to
bring up this
coordinate
last
that.
slide one
Okay.
more time. Again, when you're looking at the assessed values that we base our tax rates on, right? There's 3 categories. It's not just one for all, right?
Right.
We have the city's base, the school's base, because they get a little bit of extra where back in the annex wars, Joe probably is familiar with, where they had the apartments that are on the north side of 146th
Was
Street.
that Springmill on 146?
Yeah, yeah, remember that?
Oh, yeah.
So they get that, and then they also, the $4 billion of the community, that's the school referendums are across all of that. So that's another part of the calculation. We put this slide here at the end just to make that point, and hopefully it's sticky in that this is another part of the calculation, that's all.
So I guess my point is, or question, if it's proper, is before we change directions, we need to sit down as 2 bodies and figure out if we change, how does this impact another? Or conversely, if the school changes, how does this impact? Because there could be some pretty big movements here, and
Yeah, and I would completely agree to that as well. One thing John and I kind of talked through is when you just look at total budget numbers, us gaining first off, I would love $345,000. Please don't take it that way.
Right.
But yeah, us gaining $345,000 versus you guys losing $1 million, when you look at percentages of budgets, it's going to be a bigger impact on your side. So a lot of times when we have this conversation, it's not that I'm not advocating for the school, but it's truly looking at the whole pot of how's this adjust each person's individual budget level, almost looking at percentage-wise sometimes, compared to, I'll take an extra $345,000 any day. But at the same point,
Well,
does
to
that
your point,
invoice?
yeah, is 345 more for us worth more than you guys losing 630?
Right.
Yeah, and clearly, that isn't necessarily,
Right.
without knowing the facts and circumstances, that may or may not be the right decision.
Right.
You know, yeah, we
Well,
always
this-
would like
yeah.
more, but not at somebody else's skin.
Yeah.
Especially if the motivation for the decision was to pass the money through to the school, there's probably a better way, like through the TIF allocation, because it's
Yeah.
like a netted tax world when you look at the
Yeah,
circuit
because the
breaker.
TIF allocation wouldn't be the non-zero-sum game as much as this would be, because
Right,
if I'm
Correct.
just doing it right.
yeah, no, I think that's
Right.
exactly right, yeah.
Right. Okay.
No, but similarly, you gotta make sure the TIF covers what it was.
No, I know,
intended.
yeah, right.
I mean,
right.
we're not advocating for that either, to, hey, why don't you scalp that?
I mean, TIF is very much a dynamic factor.
Sure.
always. And, I know the varied opinions about TIF, but it's important to understand that TIF is a tool afforded to us as a local unit.
Sure.
For economic development, which is a long game, right? So it's critical that it's easy to beat up TIF, particularly when you're in the school. I've been in various places, and the argument's the same. School corporation beats up on the city because of TIF, but it's important to have a conservative approach to that, and recognizing that no one likes referendums, but it's the General Assembly that says, if you want that, you gotta pay for it.
Sure.
Right? And it does aid in that strategy. What is more is the attraction that's an economic development tool
Mhm.
at the end of the day. And single thing as a city. We're just tightening the noose around our own neck. Can't hire cops. Got to
Right.
service it though. I can't pave the street. I have to service it. And so it's a very delicate balance and a long-range view as to when we TIF something, that's why in the most recent packet, the most recent components, it's a 75-25 or whatever that may be. So we're incentivizing or attracting and creating economic growth. But now there's this component of how do we pass it through, and that's an annual decision.
I think the other interesting component to that conversation is that is a tool for the city, whereas the referendum is a tool for the schools, but they almost counteract one another if we don't do it in a harmonious way. Because each unit could abuse that. Now, obviously, voter voice wins there, but just the dynamics of that and making TIF and referendum both like dirty words is probably as much part of this conversation as, do you pass it through? Do you cut your budget? Do we hold off on projects? I mean, all of that has to come together in the conversation, and it can't ignore either component.
Live an exclusive
Yeah,
zone
yeah, you
at
can't,
all.
yeah, you have to have that whole conversation, really, otherwise it's so impactful, right? I mean, you could totally plan around one rate, or just the rates, right? You could totally make your plans around the rates, and then enter in a TIF adjustment, enter in a referendum adjustment, and it's kind of like it doesn't necessarily blow it out of the water because of the caps or whatnot, but it certainly changes the dynamic, and the allocation is then very different. So I think Brian's spreadsheet is, and I love what-if spreadsheets, and I just love spreadsheets, but I think it's a very interesting tool that you can play around and really see the impact. It's kind of, I more liken circuit breaker to like net a tax for a business, where you might make $1 million, but you got to pay tax, and so you're only left with $600,000. I kind of think of circuit breaker in the same way, and I think this spreadsheet really lends itself to seeing what the true, money to spend is. And it would be very interesting to not change this, Brian, but to make an additional where the AV shift is in play, because I think then that kind of helps bring that whole conversation around, where it be the TIF allocation, or if we would, as a school district, push an additional referendum for operations in 2023, as Brian alluded to, or maybe we wouldn't have to, right? If we could all figure out the magic combination. So.
Well, this spreadsheet, particularly this schedule here, as you manipulate it, you can see how, hey, we did something great, we only did, $1 million, we took out 628, but then you see, because it's been referenced many times before, well, the county takes a big chunk. $250,000. Well, I can promise you the county only doesn't need $250,000. I mean, mind you. Okay? I mean, when the surveyor's office is loaning the county side money at a very low interest rate, and go build 146th Street, good for them, but we could put $250,000 to better use than what they can. And I'd say that with all the county council.
Another thing that's beginning to happen in this township is that agriculture, has a long history here, but as the tax rates kind of stay up, and the farm prices are bad, you have farmers calculating, well, if I sell this ground for $50,000 an acre, I will be in Sanibel next winter, and that has an effect. And we're beginning to see that effect now, where the ground on further out, instead of infilling, where the ground further out is beginning to come under pressure for sale. And so there's all kinds of things that can happen, some of which we can control, some of which we can't, probably.
I think
But
that's a
Joe-
really good point. I think you definitely have to, as local legislators, be mindful of sprawl. Because you can go to any number of communities and see how they've gotten so spread out, and then how do you go back and redevelop and infill? I mean, so that's a theoretical conversation.
is the concern with the sprawl just the appearance of design, or is it more that you're converting 3% cap land into 2% and 1% cap land?
Well, I'm not
And-
sure, I'm not sure I really know exactly.
I don't either, that's possible,
But I-
it's great when the farmer sells his land, well, that used to be 3%, and that didn't have a cap yet, or 2%, sorry.
When a
2%,
farmer,
but
It's
if you're
probably,
starting,
the 2%, 1% is probably worth more than the 3%, right?
probably.
Yeah.
Well,
But
could
isn't
very
it
well
more
be.
an issue if they sell it to a developer and now it becomes
You're right.
part of a serviceable area where, but it's still allocated to the county? Like we have to pay for,
I just don't know when you convert the land, how. it
Right.
affects
the
it.
expenses flow to
Yeah, how
us,
it's
but
taxed
not
and how it
necessarily the
affects.
tax?
So, by local ordinance, if it's in the unincorporated areas, therefore the county, they've got to voluntarily be annexed
yeah,
into the city before any approvals occur. So we could negate that. So, as an example, we would never, in past history, of course, land be converted and approved or whatever, but still outside the corporate limits of the town. Now, it's, if you have, a tract of land and you're developer A or B or whatever, you want that to be rezoned and for a particular land use, you get to voluntarily be annexed back into the city. So we can.
To make sure that we get the funding to service the area?
but part
Okay.
of the problem with that, I mean, problems to everything, but you have, these outlier districts, housing, I mean, you have undeveloped,
Yeah,
plots inside, and those plots, they're not diminishing in value, they're increasing in value, but they don't wanna buy them because they're so expensive.
Right.
So we shoot this, we don't do it, but Citizens shoots water and gas out, way out, and, I don't know, we begin to violate our comprehensive zoning plan just a
Right.
bit in that. And again, I don't have an answer for it, but,
No.
it's a problem that affects us all.
Dwayne, I was just gonna add from your AB standpoint, that farmland, as long as it's still farmland, is only being taxed at 2% of
Tell them
farmland
about
value, which is like $5,000.
right.
Even if the land's worth $500,000, it's still 2% on 5,000. So once it switches, while it may be going to, well, it's probably getting sold to corporate or home family side, so it's going to a 1 or 3%, but you're gonna be taxing on it at the probably more realistic value, so you're gonna make up that difference pretty quickly.
That, what I call a double cap on farmland occurred, that was a legislative change in the last 3 years, I think it was.
Yeah, and it was,
It's,
they reassessed about 4 or 5 years ago, yeah, and it, yeah.
But that shows you who still controls the legislature. It's rural primarily in Indiana, and that switch hasn't happened yet.
I think even if you look at Westfield, I mean, a lot of people think of Westfield as 32 South, when really we go, what, 216, I think? So, I mean, we're still half ag when you really look at our makeup. I mean, it's easy to look at the bottom half of Westfield and think how big and sprawling we are, but there's a lot of space up north that hasn't been touched.
These problems will still be there when we're pushing up daisies, I expect, and or when I'm pushing up daisies. I don't know about you guys and
I
gals.
think it's beyond me too.
Are there any other questions or any other conversation that you guys would like to cover while we're all here?
Just as long as I can get the spreadsheets.
definitely like that spreadsheet.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that'd be awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
It'd
That's-
be our recommendation to maybe consider these 2 units to do this quarterly,
Absolutely, yeah.
just because.
At
you know
least,
things coming
right?
into your
Sure.
pipeline,
Mhm.
we'll know things coming into our pipeline, and how do they intersect.
And I would, if this time works for people, we have a standing first Tuesday of the month meeting anyways, because it falls before our board meeting, that I know your guys' schedules have been a lot harder to get together, so maybe if we could plan like the first Tuesday of a month, it would allow us to keep our schedule as well, and we could look at quarterly times. I don't know about for the city side, just throwing that out there.
Well, ironically, is this not
I
the
think it'd be a good thing.
first quarter, or it's the beginning of a quarter, so if we could meet quarterly, the first month of each quarter, is that
Yeah, I can work with John.
possible?
And we can
Yeah,
get those
I
scheduled
think it'd be
out and-
fantastic to meet
Yeah,
more
if you
frequently,
If you agree to it, it'd be in January, all the 1782 to be issued.
Right.
Where
Yeah.
everything is kind of settled for 2021, and your assumptions into our sustainability plan, you know, your board can read 175 pages, but it looks way into the future, with a lot of assumptions built into it.
So no, I mean, we all appreciate it. Our goal is just, I mean, I know, again, we all know each other, but just to get the group together at a table to have more of an official conversation opposed to maybe some sidebars or a text here or there. So
Right.
appreciate everybody getting together.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.